titled "The Role of HBCUs in Addressing Environmental and Climate Injustice in the Mid-Atlantic." Our moderator, Adrienne Hollis, is not able to join us this afternoon, but she does send her well wishes to us. And we're just going to introduce ourselves and get into just kind of the conversation. I was giving some background about the work that we do, and we're really going to focus, on sort of those two descriptive areas that's mentioned in the write-up about this panel session around sort of impacts to historically Black colleges and universities, environmental impacts, and then also what work they're doing and have done and perhaps can do to make themselves and also the communities surrounding them more resilient. And I guess I'll start first. My name is Mark Barnes. I am an associate professor at Morgan State University in Baltimore City. I'm celebrating my 10th year at Morgan, and it's just been an amazing time in working with our young people and then also others at Morgan over that period. I am a geographer. I can be classified as a human geographer broadly, but I also am well suited in urban hazards, transport, and also environmental geography subfields. My work has emphasized institutional decision making around climate change and also hazards, weather hazards, and also disasters. So that's me sort of in a nutshell. And of course, as we proceed through this panel discussion, more will be revealed.
Thank you, Professor. Good afternoon, folks. I am Lemire Tehran, just joined the faculty of Howard University. I'm an associate professor at Howard. Coincidentally, Mark or Professor Barnes, you said you've been in Maryland or at Morgan State for 10 years. I've been in Howard for about 10 days. Prior to coming to Howard, I was at SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, which is always a mouthful, which is in upstate New York, environmental-only campus. A lot of the work that I do is centered on energy policy. I do a lot of things with urban heat islands and urban heat inequality. And I'm a big tree guy, so I'm always focusing somehow the virtues of urban forestry are somehow related to the stuff that I do. But underpinning it all is just the move to democratize the environmental sciences and basically push what I call, or what many call, public science. So I hope that we'll get a chance to talk about those things today. And with that, how about we jump into it?
Sure. And this is going to be, everyone, like a sort of a back and forth. I'll share some of what got me into this space. And also Lemire, Dr. Tehran will do the same. And I think through our conversation, our dialogue will perhaps produce perhaps way more questions than answers. And so as I was telling Dr. Tehran before we began, was that, I came to this space from Rutgers, where I did the PhD 10 years ago, thinking about sort of how institutions formulate decisions or make decisions around what to do and also what not to do with respects to weather related hazards and disasters. And my work during my dissertation was to sort of look at how transit agencies moved equipment and then also communicated to passengers about sort of their stoppages. And, that got me to thinking about sort of how this is our 18th year, the 18th year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. And we know that many lives perished as a result of the lack of movement. In fact, even thinking about policy, public policy around evacuation that privileged private vehicle ownership, of course, at the expense of the transit-dependent poor. So the many people that we saw in the waters of Katrina were highly dependent on public transportation. And so that got me to thinking about sort of, okay, where does that or may possibly occur elsewhere? And you start seeing, I start seeing sort of a pattern distribution from city to city, especially, of course, large urban centers like Baltimore City, like Washington, D.C., like my hometown of Philadelphia. But I moved away from the transit aspects and then started thinking about institutions. In fact, national treasures. One day I was reading the Washington Post, and there was an article about saving our national treasures along the mall. And I asked the question, well, what about Morgan State University, which is known as a national treasure? And then that started thoughts, had me thinking about, okay, going back to Katrina and looking at institutions like Southern University and Dillard and the Xavier universities that all were nearly pushed to closure. And many of them, I think most of them, have yet to reach pre-Katrina enrollment levels. Okay, so that is certainly something to consider, especially when you start thinking about, other historically Black colleges and universities in sort of high risk hazard areas or flood prone areas. For example, University of Maryland and Eastern Shore, and also Norfolk State University. Hampton University is surrounded on three sides by water. And a number of others. And just recently today, well, not in sort of a coastal area, what we see in the news today is Clark Atlanta University that got deluged by flash flooding. And so there's a combination of exposures when we think about sort of weather, extreme weather events that are occurring more frequently and more widespread than ever before as a result, or likely due rather to climate change conditions. And so I started sort of a little short journey into one, certainly locating and identifying those HBCUs, most of which are in the Mid-Atlantic that do have some priority sort of exposures, if you will, meaning that they need to be attended to. And we need to think a little bit more intently about not only their environmental exposures, but also other exposures. And I'll just give you one off the bat. For example, when I arrived in Morgan in 2013, about a year or so after that, was the parent plus or student plus loan debacle, where a number of HBCUs faced crisis resulting from the changes in that particular program that resulted in the loss of many of their students who could no longer afford tuition. And, these kinds of exposures coupled with environmental exposures place a heavy burden on institutions, both the public HBCUs and then also certainly the private historically Black colleges. So I just wanted to put that sort of kind of as an umbrella, and then we'll just exchange.
Yeah, so to take it out the Mid-Atlantic for just a minute, I'm thinking you did a quick tour down south, and I used to work at FAMU, Florida A&M University. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about the disproportionate number of HBCUs that are literally in the states of climate denialism. Dangerous time. So me and you are lucky to be doing in work in places that, relatively, we can definitely argue about how meaningful and powerful the policies ultimately are, but we're lucky to be working geographically in places that acknowledge the realities of climate change. So as I think about the brothers and sisters at FAMU, like, it's a dangerous time to be in Florida, specifically if you want to use words like climate change. God forbid you want to use a word like climate justice. So maybe if we get a chance to talk about that during today, I think that should certainly be on the agenda as well. Let me just throw one thing out, if you don't mind. We lost our moderator, so we'll kind of riff, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
The one thing I definitely wanted to touch on, I'm thinking about the title of this session, and, automatically, my retort to the title is like, yeah, absolutely. Do HBCUs have a role to address climate inequality in our communities and beyond? Absolutely. But I want to make sure that we don't take non-HBCUs off the hook. And the reason why that's important, I'm thinking, like, isn't the state of Maryland being sued right now because HBCUs haven't gotten, their requisite funding or similar funding to non-HBCUs? So it's kind of like every 2 or 4 years, you hear the phrase, Black people saved America, with the way they voted, however you feel about that. But I want to make sure that we don't let non-HBCUs off the hook, because as everybody on this call probably knows, everybody in the video chat knows, HBCUs historically have been asked to do more with less. Like, I'm not saying anything avant-garde or revolutionary there. So we want to make sure that, we put heat on non-HBCUs, figurative heat, not literal. We want to put figurative heat on non-HBCUs to make sure that they're stepping up to address issues within environmental justice communities.
Yeah, that's a good point that you make. Again, going back to 2005, where you see the disparity in impacts, right, between a Dillard, an Xavier, and also a Southern University, where by they, in terms of sea level, right, and thinking about the topography of the landscape, they sat on lower ground, right? And so many HBCUs are in places where that perhaps may be beautiful, but perhaps at one time were somewhat undesirable, right? And so you have institutions like a Tulane University, and also the University of New Orleans, whose impacts were lesser because they sat on higher ground, right? And so we see this in different regions, in different locales, and the like. And so that's that sort of environmental justice piece that we're speaking about in terms of the role of non-HBCUs towards assisting, right? But also playing a part in so many different areas around research, around instruction, and even service. I had the opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, to do some light research, had a conversation with folks at a couple of institutions, HBCUs, around the table, sort of focus group, to talk about what some of the opportunities, or certainly the challenges they face. This was way back in 2015 to 2016, and I don't think too much has changed. But one of the challenges faced that folks spoke of, was sort of the political connections or lack thereof in these communities, right? And so sort of that town gown relationship, if you were, right? And looking at sort of how those institutions oftentimes were challenged with getting the kind of attention, right, that perhaps other institutions were getting around things like even things like cleaning, street cleaning. And then when you go back, and when I think about even what's happening in Atlanta now, and it's not just because of the flash flood, but it's also because of the infrastructure or the lack thereof. And you have to remember also, many of our institutions have a century or more year old infrastructure that they're still dealing with. And so you have to consider, some of those nagging, longstanding problems that many of our institutions are saddled by.
Yeah, so I started smiling when you were talking because I'm like, man, they really set me up. Like they put me on a panel with Brother Barnes, Dr. Barnes, and I'm like, man, what am I going to say that can kind of sound half coherent? But let me just try, okay? So as we continue this riff, you said something. You basically said that HBCUs are disproportionately centered or situated in these danger zones and climate danger zones, places that are, whether it be heat, areas that are heat trapping, flooding, increased propensity of flooding. You talked about the older infrastructure. And I really believe that's going to force, or it should force, I don't know if it will, it should force us to reimagine how curriculum looks like in these places. And I'm not talking about the curriculum in the classroom. We'll get to that later. But if we agree, and I think your work is brilliant, if we agree that these places are disproportionately centered in climate hotspots, we got to reimagine how we're training faculty, staff, and students to keep our people alive. What am I talking about? I'm talking about mandatory CPR trainings. And we know that that's going to be important for climate vulnerability. So if you work at this place, I don't care what your position is. If you're a student, I don't care, first year, PhD, everybody that comes through the doors of these spots, you got to have your CPR training. You got to have your first aid training. You got to have your stop the bleeding training. So let's reimagine what education looks like. And, that's going to help us democratize what science looks like. It's not just for tuition payers. It's not just for the students coming in who are paying, X $1,000s per year. But if we want to keep people in our communities, any community alive, we got to make sure that our people are equipped to do so. And that starts with training that in emergency situations that are literally lifesavers.
Yeah, I like that I really appreciate that you shared that. One of my colleagues, Dr. Melissa Littlefield in social work, actually would do sort of a mock training, like in conjunction, I want to say with the Red Cross. I remember that so several years ago, but haven't seen that since. We do know that there is a small group of HBCUs that do focus on first responders. They have a program, and please forgive me, right now I don't know the name of the program, but there is sort of a small consortium group. But you're absolutely right, Dr. Turan. We require at this moment in time sort of not just 21st century preparation, but also I've been talking to my students about the 22nd century, and they just look at me like, what is he talking about? We're still in the 21st century. We're only 75 years away. And the idea, and I think this goes to your work, is about sustainability, right? It's about positioning, as you mentioned, and I'm really glad that you said our faculty, our staff, our students, and even our alumni, right? The alumni population, because it's not just the exposures. All right. So when I talk about, folks think about sort of this huge prophetic, it's going to be sort of similar to what we may see in a film like The Day After, right? And all hell breaks loose, right? That's not really how climate change is. It's gradual, right? It's a gradual process. And then we see sort of these sort of extreme or abnormal outlier types of events, right? Like a Hurricane Katrina, like a Hurricane Sandy, like some of the record heat waves that we've been seeing as of late too, right? And then they go away, and then they disappear, and then they come back. But like you said, it has to be a consistent, continual project that we engage with across the disciplines, right? This has to be transdisciplinary. It's not only geography, but it's architecture and planning. It's not only architecture and planning, but it's also civil engineering. Civil engineering, it's also in business. And so the question, how do we sort of get everyone on the same page is perhaps the question.
Yeah. So one way we get folks on the same page, I think, is we got to start thinking a lot more about what our partnerships look like beyond the universities. Thinking about the work when I was situated, relatively new to Howard, as I said, when I was based in upstate New York, partnered with a small community organization, Force, focusing our resources on community empowerment or enlightenment. Please forgive me if I got the acronym wrong. But the point is, community-based organization who, if you look at their mission statement, nowhere in their mission statement, nowhere on their website does it say environmental justice. But when you're talking about community empowerment, when you're talking about community enlightenment, when you talk about public health services, emergency management services, those are some of the services that this organization was centered on. That's the embodiment of environmental justice. How do we keep our areas safe? So I think that we really got to think about what do partnerships look like, and how do we get folks who have historically been excluded from our campuses, marginalized from our campuses, how do we get those bodies, those butts in seats for non-tuition payers? Because if we believe that the content that we're offering is, whether it be the sustainability content, architectural content, the engineering, the business, we got to do more when we're talking about climate change. We got to do more to kind of spread the word as to what can be done, and think about the expertise. We got to democratize our labs. If we're getting these grants, $5 million, $10 million, we have equipment that can be helpful in communities, whether it be that X-ray fluorescence monitor or analyzer, all the equipment in our labs. We got to make sure that that equipment doesn't just stay holed up in somebody's office. If our work is truly about environmental inequality and beating that back, we got to make sure that people in communities have access to this to the equipment. Now, that doesn't mean that you just hand out a $20,000 monitor to anybody that knocks on the door, but if the relationships are strong, and that's what we got to make sure they are, we got to make sure that the technology extends beyond campuses.
What's in the name, right? So, and I think you're like spot on with that. I think about, again, Howard University. It's a name. Morgan State is a name. Virginia Union, and so on and so forth. And those names have social cachet, right? Social capital in many respects, right? And opening the doors wider. And that's because, when I think about HBCUs, it's not that we haven't opened the doors. It's like, how do we open them wider, right? And so, like, for example, I think about at Morgan State, we have seen some benefits. And then just to kind of go back to what you mentioned about the 4 HBCUs in Maryland suing the state, they won. And they're in process now of, I guess, funneling that money to the institutions for further investment in program infrastructure and so on and so forth. But I think back to sort of where I am, we have a growing, what I would call a geospatial campus. We have faculty across discipline lines, not only in geography, but also in architecture and planning. Even our folks down at the Patuxent Environmental and Aquatic Research Laboratory, they're working with geospatial technologies like GIS and even GPS to look at restoration issues around oysters. I love oysters, and like I was just down there this summer. And we also even have at Morgan State University a new center, the Center for Urban Health Equity. Some here may be familiar with the name. Again, what's in the name? Dr. Lawrence Brown, whose work, The Black Butterfly, has been so instrumental in bringing forth new truths as well as new visions about what Black Baltimore can be in the future with regards to increased amounts of support, municipal, state, of course, also federal support to remove the dead hand of the past, if you will, when you think about the legacy of redlining in many Baltimore City neighborhoods. And as you said, we must do more, and we can do more to provide the kinds of supports, assistance. And I think that's what this new EPA grant, again, what's in the name? EPA grant on thriving communities, these thriving communities technical assistance centers that's what this is for, right? It's for us to begin not just individually, but collectively working together. Morgan State working in collaboration with Howard University, right? We got some really great things we're doing. You all have some really great things that you're doing. You know, how can we increase our visibility in doing those things? I think that's a big issue. I think because a lot of people may not know what's being done at our institutions, and so we got to get the word out.
Yes. And you mentioned the phrase opening the doors. And what I'm going to push us to do, so a few minutes ago, I was saying, hey, we need to open up the bounds of our campus to the community organizations and folks who live in neighborhoods adjacent to our campuses. We got to do a better job opening the doors globally as well, like to the ultimate HBCUs. Like just yesterday morning, I was on a call with about 30 to 40 doctoral students at Addis Ababa University. And these are all students who are looking for different levels of mentorship, professors around the world. Like, how can you help support us through our PhD trajectory? But it doesn't just have to be doctoral students. Like as Black folk, we have Black institutions. Like if we think that the threats of climate change that we saw this summer, the crazy heat, we saw flooding in Morocco, just a couple, like if we think that these threats are real, then you're not going to work your way out that problem with just 10% of your population, much less than that when you're talking about the number of people who actually walk through the doors of an HBCU, whether they're working there, studying there, or whatever the case may be. So what does your economic policy look like? Howard, Morgan State, Eastern Shore, what do your economic agreements look like? Business schools at these places with brothers and sisters at UWI in the Caribbean, University of West Indies, Addis Ababa University, universities all across the diaspora, whether they be in South America, the Caribbean, the US, or the continent Africa. So I think that we got to be serious about opening the doors globally, cross-campus arrangements, whether it be for business relationships, climate relationships. What's your food policy? I don't want to just know about what your food policy is on campus. Let's talk about, do we have global arrangements where we can better be equipped, or we can be better equipped to feed ourselves? So like, that's where the game is really going to be played. We know what climate inequality looks like in this country. And in 10 years, like I can do all the research, you can do all the research, but I think that the partnerships are really going to be the game changing, or potentially the game changing activity. So I think that we have to be more strategic with our partnerships. And those partnerships gotta extend beyond the continental U.S.
Local activities have global implications, and of course, global phenomena becomes manifest locally. So I like what you said about sort of our outreach or our broader reach, right, towards having and just thinking about the diaspora, right? So when I think about the diaspora, and looking abroad, but also coming back home too, right? So I'm not a product, if you will, of an HBCU. However, I am certainly, or when I was in college, could fit the profile of someone who most HBCUs do serve. And so when I think about that, are you still with us, Dr. Teran? You seen oh, there you go.
These.
Yeah. So when I think about that, I think we have to do even a job of reaching out to our brothers, and our sisters from majority institutions as well, right? And I know there have oftentimes been tensions, but we're part of this higher education diaspora, and we have people in these places. Fellow faculty, administrators, et cetera, and so forth, that could also lend a hand of support in these sorts of endeavors. So I guess the message that I really want to put out there is that we shouldn't leave anybody out, out of the conversation and discussion, and because we all have connections in some way, shape, form, or another to these anchor institutions in these neighborhoods.
You're right on point when you say we can't leave folks out. I'm thinking about my undergraduate experience at University of Georgia, and I think 19 when I was there. We won't get into years, but it was about a 5% Black student population. Fast forward many years later, and the numbers are probably just as paltry. I think they're almost identical to what they were back in the day. So I say all that to say, to go back to your point, we got to make sure the campuses, there's cross-cultural connections. I remember I had a professor at this campus. He's a brother. He's like, hey, consider the percentage of Black faculty at the university, which wasn't many. Consider the percentage of Black students and staff at the university, which wasn't many. He was like, hey, Black students at this campus, they need to hear these messages as well. So I think that you're right on point that it can't be an isolationist thing, because there are brothers and sisters and decent people generally on these campuses who we got to make sure that the messages are being cross-pollinated and disseminated beyond the boundaries.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about boundaries, I'm good with those segue ties, man. Speaking about boundaries and kind of coming back to HBCUs and thinking about the program description and thinking about sustainability issues. My question to you is sort of what may or have HBCUs done towards it, because I mentioned earlier about the sustainability issue and the legacy, right? But from your point of view, in terms of the infrastructure, the buildings, and the like, because there's still a lot of work needs to be done. Although Morgan is undergoing unprecedented growth in its facilities, we still are faced with some challenges because we still want to preserve the old, right? As we make way for the new. And I think this could be sort of a spillover effect into surrounding neighborhoods if we get this right. So with regards to sustainable practices on HBCU campuses, how might you see them again addressing environmental and also climate injustice?
Yeah, so it's really going to be predicated on what are the sustainability and environmental skill sets and specialties at universities. So I'm thinking about my time at FAMU. We did some climate work where I was sitting at the law school, which isn't at Tallahassee. I was actually at the Orlando campus. No, I'm not a lawyer, but for whatever reason, I was situated in the Orlando campus. And we had a partnership with the local farm workers association. So you're not just talking about climate. At that point, farm workers disproportionately exposed to heat. You're talking about labor. You got to be at this seat. Think about what's going on with the UAW right now. 3 factories, folks that say, hey, we're opting out until we have dignified wages. So thinking about the specialty of that particular campus, the environmental law skill sets, we were able to, I think, create some effective partnerships and do some work with the local sustainability community. And at the apex of that is your farm workers, because guess what? If you don't have people who are helping you eat, you're not going to make it very long in this world. And then when you start to think about where other campuses are situated, and I can't speak to the specialties of every one, but Eastern Shore, phenomenal relationship with NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So you're talking about a campus that I would imagine has some incredible capacities to engage in the GIS work that you do, all types of remote sensing and monitoring. I think that skill set is going to be critical, not just for the Maryland Eastern Shore, but you got Delaware. You mentioned Philly, where you're from, coastal city. Many may not know that. Wilmington, right on down to the tidewater of Virginia, on into North Carolina. These are all population centers for our people. So I would say just let's make sure that we're marrying the expertise of each campus to some issues where they can engage in some critical work that really takes advantage of not just their geography, but the infrastructure, the academic infrastructure, the research infrastructure that they have in place. And just let me add one more thing to kind of pivot just a little bit. We got to make sure that we're reimagining this classroom or the classroom curriculums. Environmental studies program, like I'm in a newly created department. It's not even online yet at Howard. Fall 24 is going to be the first year for the Department of Earth, Environment, and Equity. So as we start to think about, well, what is your coursework when you're training young folks, 18, 20, graduate students, 25, 30 years old? How is your coursework? How is your curriculum reacting to the skill sets that are going to be most critical in this new climate reality? So not everybody's going to be a geographer, but we need to make sure that a ton of folks are exposed to that curriculum. Not everybody's going to be a food scientist or engaged in food security work, but we want to make sure that folks have a responsible amount of coursework in area like food sustainability. I teach an intro class every Wednesday, and guess what we were doing this past Wednesday? In addition to talking about food inequality, we took about the past 30 minutes or the last 30 minutes of class. We went outside. We started measuring trees. And you might start thinking, well, what do trees have to do with food inequality? That's the point. When you're thinking about food insecure communities, why don't we have more food forests, whether it be in places like DC or Baltimore or places of urban Maryland, PG County, or whatever the case may be? So we're going to have a curriculum that's reflective of, hey, you think food insecurity is going to be exacerbated by climate change? Let's make sure that we're giving students opportunity to engage in work where they can truly say, hey, urban planning, community planning of the 20th century, you failed. In order for us to make it in the 22nd century, as you said, with any level of dignity, you're going to have a curriculum that meets the challenges to get to that 75-year time period.
Wow, you just kind of like made me smile because I've been focused on revolutionizing sort of geography at Morgan. And there's a larger discussion being had among geographers around sort of those 100 level courses that used to be, more survey, right, and construction, and you got to learn the key concepts, and you read the textbook and you memorize that, and then you take the test, and then that's it, right? And right now, over the last few years, actually, I've kind of trashed that as well, where we do go outside and we do map, build natural, social, environment features, right, of great cause and consequence to surrounding neighborhood communities. And while we're there and thinking about sort of the role and actually who's leading and is going to really lead this revolution, as you kind of alluded to, students. It's the students who's going to lead that revolution, and they have the voices. Like I can tell the chair or the dean or the provost and even our president, hey, we need this, right? However, I know if our students, or we want to do that, our students' voices are way louder than mine. I can assure you of that. So thinking about the sort of the next generation, and we haven't really spoken about them because, and this was mentioned actually yesterday in one of the forums yesterday, is the next generation, those who are coming behind us. What thoughts do you have about, further engaging, galvanizing not only undergraduates, but even the ones, because we need these pipelines, K through 12.
Yeah, so I wish I had the secret sauce to that 20 years ago. So before this current version of myself, I used to teach middle school and high school. And man, if I knew some things then that I know now, just in terms of my approach to the classroom, maybe I'd still be teaching middle school. I didn't make it in middle school very long. I went running back to high school, man. That's another story for another day. But
Yeah.
so I don't have the answer to that. But I think one thing that we do have to teach, whether it be prospective students, current students, grad students, we got to model, because you can't teach this. We got to start modeling courage better. And, some people call it speaking truth to power. But, so if you're in if you happen to be in one of my classes, turn this part down. I don't want you to hear this part. But I've told my students for years, I don't care who gets the A on the test. That's, who did the reading. That's one thing. The person that really gets the A in environmental justice class, I'm not going to know that until 3 or 5 or 7 years down the line. Are you going to be at a job and be so well adjusted to the sexism and racism and homophobia at these workplaces that you're a mannequin and you don't say anything? That's the person that should get an A in my class, but I'll never be able to tell. So what should we be modeling? You could tell somebody, hey, follow King, follow X, but we got to do a better job modeling. You think about the situations that happen, and we're seeing all types of crazy policies come from different states. And hey, if I speak out on these issues, it may affect my propensity to get a grant, or it may mean I don't get a promotion. Man, if we're truly trying to address these issues, it can't be so much about, man, my livelihood is going to be threatened. Now, I always tell my students, you say the right thing, you do the right thing, there can be consequences. So we don't want anybody to run into a situation that's naive, but we got to just do a better job of modeling courage and showing our students. Hey, alumni, perfect example. Maybe one way to do that is to fortify those relationships, so we're not so dependent on power structures and we can't speak freely in situations. If we have better interaction between, brothers and sisters who are alumni, this person's vetted, we'll make sure that this brother or sister gets a job so they can say what they need to say. I just think we need to do a better job of modeling courage. And it can't be about somebody's research agenda. It can't just be about, hey, I got my tenure. That used to kill me. I'd see people pre-tenure. This has nothing to do with HBCUs. To go back to your earlier point, academia in general, just people, hey, I can't do this until I get my tenure. And I just always thought that was so incredibly whack. What's the point of getting a PhD if you're just going to be a mannequin until some fame point of liberation? So that's not a HBCU thing. I think that's an academic thing. We got to be more courageous.
You really said a mouthful there, and I think about what I do to expose, in my weather and climate class, actually across the board, whether it's physical geography, and even my introduction to geography is something I've done in the past. I've introduced them to courageous people in the movement, the Majora Carters of the world, the Robert Bullards of the world. And name after name after name after name, right? And showing our young people that there are persons out there, who are battle tested, who are extremely knowledgeable in every sort of space, whether we're talking about, it from the neighborhood community, level, right? All the way up to folks like a Dr. Jacoby Wilson, who's a dynamo, of course, but so many of us, and that is what needs to actually come forth a little bit more from our institutions, because it's not that there's a shortage. It's not that there's a shortage of us, and for the young people to model. It's for me, it's a visibility issue, right? And that might even lead to an accessibility issue where they may not see themselves, in those kinds of roles, if you will. So going back to the role of HBCUs, and maybe one of the roles as HBCUs is to extract, to mine all of that information, that data, to share with, not only the people, who are within the architectural footprints of our campuses, but also the persons outside, and bringing them in, like you said earlier, bringing them in on board, so that they can be a part of what is truly the university. Because I've been really focused on that, myself, in having our young people be exposed to the Marshall Shepherds of the world. You may be familiar with him. He's a world-renowned meteorologist at the University of Georgia. You mentioned Georgia earlier. And just to have them see that there are people who look like them that does this work.
Yep. So listen, I know you're probably familiar. You're probably a part of this network, but to go back to the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, they have cooperative, what are called environmental or science, environmental cooperative centers at HBCUs all around the country, the Southeast, going in over towards Texas and the Mid-Atlantic. There's a hub at Eastern Shore. There's a hub at Howard, just hub down in Florida. To speak to the point that you made about modeling, where you have young folks who are getting this credentialing, young folks who are getting bachelors and masters and PhDs in the environmental sciences, who are working directly with these NOAA affiliated scientists from all around the country, some of which look like them, some of which don't. And the work, I think, that's being pressed out or pushed out by these cooperative science centers has been pretty astounding over the last, 15 years or 20 years, however long they've existed. It's definitely been greater than a decade. So everybody online, make sure you take a look, do a web search, NOAA Cooperative Science Centers, and you'll see a long train of work in which young HBCU students have gotten good mentorship from environmental scientists.
Yeah, I know in my field, just recently, but actually for some time, inventory was conducted by Joe Darden, Dr. Joe Darden, over at Michigan State University, Black geographer. But we want to get away from me being a Black geographer. I'm not just I'm a geographer, right? And just again, that visibility piece and bringing all of those, the geosciences, the geospatial sciences, right? Like all of them together. There's an entire universe of Black superheroes, so to speak, that I believe we could work towards really bringing together. I know we have. I think we're supposed to go until 4:30, but it's just been the two of us rapping. I don't know how this is working with folks who, I don't know if they could put comments and give us questions. Yeah. I don't know about you, but I would like to hear from the audience, if there is an audience. I don't even know if there are folks here.
Yeah, so we go to 4:15, and I see that a couple of folks have already started populating the message board. So
okay,
let's get it started. If it's not shown on your screen, maybe I'll play quarterback. Yeah, very inartfully.
Would you mind doing that?
Yeah, so LA born, I don't want to butcher the username. So somebody is acknowledging some earlier comments just in terms of being free and liberated and being careerist and just not being so well adjusted to that. And this person says that's part of any job. So that's not unique amongst academic. Hey, that's part of any job. People who are trying to balance being a liberated individual and doing the right thing and being overly focused on what the stakes are. James B. Powers makes a comment on anti-fragility. How can we make our communities, so-called disadvantaged or marginalized communities, more anti-fragile so that they become stronger in some way when they're exposed to a climate hazard? And let me take this one. So, once again, I won't pretend to have the answer. I don't know if, to extend it a little bit beyond climate inequality, I don't know if our communities can become stronger after a Flint water crisis or a Hurricane Katrina that wipes out a good deal of our communities along the Gulf Coast and the Caribbean as well. So I don't want to make that argument, but go back to something I was saying earlier. We got to have more responsible global relationships, not just HBCUs, disadvantaged communities generally. Like, so if we're not asking serious questions, like if we think that our communities are disproportionately faced with shorter lifespans due to food inequality, racism, and law enforcement, whatever the case may be, we got to have relationships where, we got food inequality, we got health inequality. How do we beat these things back? I think that there are some external relationships that we got to get better at. What does that mean? It means that your food policy is not just going to be a local policy. It's going to be how we connected with food networks from around regions, around the country, and ultimately around the planet. So it's not just going to be a local food agenda. When we think about the intellectual prowess and the research prowess of our centers and our communities, it can't just be, hey, I got credential from University X, so now I'm the expert and I'm going to be the big man or big woman to deal with all this climate inequality in the Mid-Atlantic. We got to start doing a better job of making sure that we're not taking advantage in a sinister way, but taking advantage of intellect and knowledge from all around the world and research from all around the world. I truly believe that, because I think the state of our crises is grave to the point of you're not going to solve this within a 100-mile radius of yourself. We got to look beyond. And I think that there are some brothers and sisters globally who are definitely interested in that type of activity.
May I say something to the idea, concept of resilience? One, I never bought into that concept of resilience, and when I started seeing that idea of resilience, and it goes back to something that you mentioned earlier about doing more with less, right? The idea of even Black bodies being superhuman, they are not, right? And so I feel like that whole notion of resilience is wrapped up in some other kind of stuff. All right. To give people fewer resources than what they actually have the right to have and what they deserve. Right. So I never bought into that concept of resilience. I've been more focused on exposures, vulnerability, and certainly adaptation. We do know that communities do have some answers. They do have knowledge and knowledges that they have used to cope and even overcome. And I think this actually plays into the title actually of our panel. The role of HBCUs. I mean, the struggles, right? Tell them we are rising, right? That documentary looking at the history of Black colleges and universities, and much of what they overcame, how they overcame the setbacks, the obstacles, the blockades, right? And they have grown as a result. In many instances stronger, yet they can't continue, right? Especially as climate change and other exposures ramp up, to think about the pace that they may not be able to keep pace with all of the changes that are on the horizon, and actually that are right here, right present, right now. I mean, we just came through a global pandemic that revealed our vulnerabilities in many respects. And even when we think about, and I think about, I think about sort of actions after the storm that have been put in place, and I'll give New Jersey as an example. New Jersey as an example, post Hurricane Sandy, 2012. Governor Chris Christie said, we're stronger than the storm. No, you're not. In many cases, maybe you've grown much dumber as a result, where they began to repopulate flood prone areas, and then also even try to make these areas more resilient by lifting up houses that actually perhaps resulting in greater risk exposures, right? So this whole idea of resilience, I don't buy it. But in terms of thinking about HBCUs and how they may be of support as everyone is going through, these crises, I think that HBCUs, one, at their mission, at their core, are about making marginalized and vulnerable, disenfranchised groups much stronger. But they need greater support. And that support can come through, as you were mentioning, through these partnerships, with community groups, with other sort of local agencies if they haven't had them before. But I like to go back and say, we got to do a much better job of communicating, our successes, and also communicating our failures.
Yeah, absolutely. And to just go back to the penultimate statement that you made in terms of training, and to marry this with James Powers' question, just what does that training look like? So I want to talk more, not necessarily today. I think we got 18 minutes left, but I want to talk more about, do we have hubs within these HBCUs where we're talking about making more efficient or more powerful solar technology? Like, that's something that's going to directly benefit any disadvantaged community, hell, any community across the planet. So we got to start talking about, hey, let's start training folks and developing technologies that are literally going to power the future. Do we have hubs within these campuses where we're thinking about avant-garde ways to remediate hazardous and toxic soil, things that are going to technologies that are going to remediate hazardous and toxic air? And no, please don't take that snippet, anybody, and say, hey, this guy is thinking that we're going to tech fix our way out of this pain. Absolutely not. Because that's going to do that. That's going to have the opposite effect for, we got a way to filter the air. We can create more fence line communities. We can create more toxic. So please don't anybody take that out of context. But we got to be leaders when it comes to innovation, because we know that our communities in many cases are most starved for innovation. But it can't just be a technical thing. Like, it's some old school fixes that we got to do a better job at proliferating training on as well. Things like, what does weatherization look like? I'm thinking about the city of DC's sustainable energy utility, a very important renewable energy hub. But a good deal of their mission isn't just creating a new shiny technology. A lot of their work is built on the back of how can we weatherize houses. And that's not always we're going to put a nice solar shingle up, or we're going to do a geothermal unit that costs $40,000. There are some very easy and simple fixes. So maybe if our campuses are very strong foundationally, and we know that they are, we'll build on those basics. And I think there's a lot of opportunity that's going to directly benefit student training, but these are technologies that can be disseminated into communities locally and far beyond.
Great, thank you. Ishmael, I can see now. Ali says it's not a charter fund. I'm not sure what that is pointed to. But are there any other questions before we do a cool down, if you will? I really like this kind of panel conversation here. It was really good. Before we do a cool down, I'm gonna do like back in global pandemic days, going once, going twice. You're out. Any last words? Any last words, Dr. Turan?
Yeah. So number one, I feel like I didn't know there wouldn't be a moderator, but I'm glad that we had a chance to be introduced. And I think you're doing some really cool things. And like, to anybody, I'm not going to expose my page of notes, but I've talked to you for the past 45 minutes or so, and I got a page of notes. So thank you for allowing me to be under your tutelage. Number two, I think so many times we congregate, or we come in clusters like this and we talk about these issues. I just want to say a personal charge to you. Let's make sure that me and you stay connected, because I think there's a lot of overlaps between the things that you're doing and the things that I'm doing and thinking about. So I want to make sure that we keep these relationships strong. And the folks online in the comment section, as I said, I'm not hard to find. This professor is not hard to find. We're two very publicly facing institutions. Come work with us in a formal capacity if you're interested as a student. But if you're interested in doing some things in relation to how do we democratize this work, how do we make sure that environmental science goes beyond that 40-person classroom or 40-seat classroom, doing some things, the extend in communities to make sure that we have a new wider set of students who are hearing the virtues of environmental strength, then let's make sure that you're not a stranger as well. So in the same way that I told Dr. Barnes, let's make sure that we keep our conversation and dialogue going. I'm not hard to find. Please reach out. And I'll leave it at that and pass the baton, my friend.
Oh, great. Thank you. I'm humbled and also flattered, Dr. Turan. In fact, you gave me some things to really, truly think about as well. So I want to thank you for that. It was definitely a pleasure meeting you. I was born by the river. I think that's what I'll end up with. I'll end with this. It's something I sent to some folks earlier today, in terms of they asked the question on Facebook about what should people know about your past to better know you. And I think for the great majority of Black Americans, we many of us have actually lived, grown up, was born really near environmental, like waterways, green spaces, all of those things, all of those, sort of things that oftentimes we believe or have been maybe even told subliminally that we're not a part of, or that we're not connected to, and we're not stewards of. That's all poppycock. Okay. And I think about the work of a geographer whose name escapes me, and she would be so upset with me. But she wrote this book titled, Carolyn Finney. Okay. So she's a cultural geographer who wrote this wonderful book about, reimagining. I think you spoke about reimagining, Dr. Turan, a couple of times, reimagining sort of these spaces, and also imagining, our connection, to these sort of green spaces and these also blue spaces that give us life. And without them, they definitely give us something that's totally opposite, of course. So I just wanted to leave folks with that, and also to say to those of you who did attend or are in attendance, thank you for participating in this panel. And then, of course, thank you for participating in the overall symposium. Thank you.
And before folks get out of here, one last announcement. We have a closing plenary, environmental justice and economic empowerment, financial roundtable on the greenhouse gas reduction fund starting at 4:30. So you came today to listen about HBCU's role. My brilliant colleague, he ended with Sam Cooke. Hopefully you caught it. I was born by the river. Change is coming. The change is not coming. The change is here. And the change is also going to happen at 4:30. So you got 26 minutes. Get yourself a snack, get hydrated, and make sure that you join that final roundtable, that final plenary at 4:30. Thank you, folks. I really enjoyed this, Professor.
Bye-bye. I did too. Be well.